Hi everyone, this is Maggie Byrns, and we're going to be looking at examining the impacts of a strategic comprehensive diversity plan by applying the marginal man theory. Quite a bit of research has indicated that marginalized underserved groups of students are at much higher risk of dropping out of college. By underserved students, we mean minority groups, first-generation college students, and so forth. Schools are under a great deal of pressure to improve retention rates for this group of students and get them to graduate in 4 years. So many have turned to developing diversity and inclusion plans to improve the experiences for this traditionally underserved group of students who often face marginalization at their colleges. How can we evaluate these diversity plans to see if they're actually reducing feelings of marginality? The marginal man theory constructs offer a theoretical framework to examine how diversity plans may or may not be reducing marginality for this underserved group of students. A little bit of background information on this study. So as we said, underserved groups of students tend to have lower retention and completion rates. Colleges have made some strides with these groups, but they still lag behind other traditional college students. A lot of times students report from these groups, they report feelings of marginality and isolation as the primary reasons for leaving school when they're at predominantly white institutions. And colleges in response have developed diversity and inclusion plans to help improve the retention rates for these students. How can we examine the impacts of these diversity plans? Are these plans working? Are they reducing feelings of marginality for these students? And so a small liberal arts college in Florida has set up a diversity and inclusion plan. We want to find a way to measure if the plan is improving outcomes and actually reducing marginality as we hope it will. So our goal, of course, is improving diversity and inclusion at this institution. And research has shown that engagement on campus is really key. Students have to feel like they're part of the campus community and engaged in what's happening both inside and outside the classroom in order to reduce marginalization. High impact practices such as community service projects, collaborative learning, and just generally developing a rapport with faculty member tends to help with this engagement. Additionally, underserved students tend to lack resources and support. Even when campuses do offer resources, academic support, or financial support for students, a lot of times these groups of students aren't even aware that these things exist, or they don't exist at all. These diversity plans we're hoping will fill the gaps and, like I said, kind of close the gaps between these underserved groups of students and the traditional college students. And what we're looking for is a framework that we can use to examine the impact of these diversity plans and find out if they're really having an effect on students. So the purpose of this case study is to examine how a comprehensive strategic diversity plan at a small liberal arts college in Florida may reduce the sense of marginality among minority students. So the overarching research question is, how does a comprehensive strategic diversity plan at a small liberal arts college in Florida reduce the sense of marginality among minority students? Sub-questions are based on the constructs of the theory, and so we're interested in looking at how the comprehensive strategic diversity plan at the small liberal arts college in Florida will reduce the sense of psychological marginality, of social marginality, and of cultural marginality among minority students. And lastly, how does the previous lack of a comprehensive strategic diversity plan at a small liberal arts college in Florida create marginal men out of minority students? So in other words, before the plan was in place, how did this increase feelings of marginality? The marginal man theory was first proposed by Robert Park in 1928, and he used it to describe feelings of marginality that were experienced by immigrants moving to America. It explains the marginality that's felt by living in the borders or on the fringes of two different worlds. Somebody is not really able to be a member of either society if they're feeling marginality, their old one or their new one. Golovinsky gave a really good quote at describing the marginal man. He said, "It lives in the twilight zone of two cultures and is torn between a nostalgic love for the old and a growing attachment to the new. He is on the fringe, the periphery of two modes of life." The theory has been refined quite a bit and contextualized throughout the 20th century. There's been quite a bit of change over the last few years in terms of different contexts we can apply this theory to. So as we said, Park initially described the theory referring to immigrants, and then Stonequist later expanded on the theory and described cultural marginality based on a dominant culture imposing its norms on a subordinate culture, and he applied this mostly to biracial individuals. Goldberg noted that later in 1941 that the theory could apply to marginality either based on birth, as the case with somebody who's biracial, for example, or as a situation that someone's in, for example, immigrants, and he specifically talked about Jewish immigrants. Antonovsky took issue with some of Goldberg's assertions in 1958 that the people in the marginal man group have ongoing personal issues. Said Goldberg tended to base his characterizations on too many assumptions and not on enough empirical evidence, and he actually called for more research to test the theory. And then Wright in 1979 gave a very clear refinement of the theory and broke it down into the various constructs that we use today to describe the different types of marginality that somebody in the marginal man group may experience in different situations. So the constructs, of course, are marginality, the marginal man group. So anyone in the marginal man group is the person living in between two worlds, experiencing the marginality. In our study, those are the underserved groups of college students, minority, first-generation students, LGBTQ students, international students, etc. Cultural marginality can be thought of as the norms and customs associated with the dominant culture. These behaviors may be tacitly imposed on the subordinate culture, causing feelings of marginality for the student in our study. Psychological marginality are the shared internal attitudes and perspectives that students in the marginal man group may face. And so they may come together and feel some camaraderie with each other, but they all share these same characteristics and attitudes. And then social marginality can be thought of as the patterns of social behavior that exist either within the marginal man group or between the marginal man group and the members of the dominant culture. So the interaction and how those two people interact. So some application of the marginal man theory to the current study. As we said, feelings of marginality are very common with underserved groups of students at predominantly white institutions. Other studies have used these constructs to describe how students feel marginalized and what strategies students may use to cope with feelings of marginalization. Institutions have a responsibility to work towards helping students reduce these feelings. Feelings of marginality through diversity and inclusion plans is a good way to do that. And this allows institutions to offer support to students and help them develop a campus culture of respect and inclusion. Constructs of the marginal man theory provide a really good framework to evaluate the effectiveness of the diversity plans. And that's the reason I chose the marginal man theory, because its constructs offer us a good way to look at the different types of marginality that these students may face and whether or not the plan is reducing those feelings of marginality. Some current empirical studies that look at underserved groups of students and how they experience marginality on their campus. Clayton looked at racial regard of biracial students at historically black institutions and compared that to the racial regard of biracial students at predominantly white institutions. So racial regard can be thought of as how one views their own identity, and this can be either public or private, and sometimes those two things clash, causing feelings of marginality. Many of the students in the research had already had negative views or negative stereotypes that they believed about themselves and about their race prior to entering college. What the researcher found was that the racial regard turned out to be much higher for students at the historically black colleges and universities, and this was attributed to more exposure to similar peers and faculty members. The implication that the researcher suggested for predominantly white institutions is that they have to find ways to increase diversity because this will help improve the racial regard for those marginalized groups of students. Jones also looked at racial regard by interviewing African American student leaders at predominantly white institutions. And what the researcher found was that these students experience a strong sense of double consciousness and feelings of marginality. They often experience microaggressions from their peers, often on a daily basis. And the researcher was interested in what kinds of coping strategies the students used to handle these feelings of marginality and this racial regard. And the researcher found that the students really worked to keep collective ties and strong bonds among each other. And they also focused on maintaining a high private racial regard, which seemed to make a big impact on their public racial regard. In another study, Ellis et al. Looked at first-generation college students to get a sense of what their daily experiences were like. They asked students what happened to them on a daily basis on campus, and they classified their experiences as either microaggressions or microaffirmations. Microaffirmations can be thought of as any kind of compliments or positive comments or just words of encouragement that the students receive from faculty members or their peers. And what they found was it's made a really big difference in reducing their sense of marginality and helping the students felt like they belong, gain a little bit more confidence. So the researchers recommended that any diversity plan has to include some kind of professional development on ways to help underserved groups feel like they belong by using microaffirmations whenever possible, because it's tended to be really effective with the first-generation college students in their research. In another study by Longwell, Grease et al., researchers looked at first-generation college students in various settings to see what kinds of common causes of marginality that they could find. They looked at students at private, predominantly white institutions, graduate students, and students at two-year schools, all that were first-generation college students. What they found was that they lacked a lot of information on available resources like tutoring and financial assistance. They felt in general that they had less cultural capital than other students, and this tended to really affect their sense of marginality. They also, interestingly enough, felt a little sense of marginality by their family members. Because they were first-generation college students, they really were worried about a sense of marginality and alienation that they felt with regard to their family members who hadn't gone to college since they were the first in their family. And they emphasized that even though family members were supportive, they really worried that they would lose some of the common threads that they had with their family members. And this made them feel a little bit less confident, a little bit more discouraged. The researchers in the study suggested that this really emphasizes there is a need for school diversity plans to include, again, better training for faculty members and advisors. Advisors and mentors seem to really make a difference with this group of underserved students, and so they recommended that institutions have to account for this special needs by this first-generation college students by offering more professional development. One final study looked at LGBTQ students. This group has limited research, but is fortunately receiving a little bit more attention. Researchers in this study found that LGBTQ students often experience microaggressions on campus pretty regularly. They tend to have lower retention rates because they just don't feel like they belong. They really lack that sense of belonging on campus. The researchers here interviewed a large group of students, and in compiling all their research data and their interview data, what they recommended is that diversity plans have to include resource centers. The students found they really benefited from having resource centers and student organizations on campus that would help them navigate issues and connect with each other. They also recommended that all diversity and inclusion plans include non-discrimination policies, and that they generally focus on fostering a campus climate of diversity and inclusion. So the rationale for the current study, based on existing research, what we've seen is that the research highlights the marginality of underserved student groups. It talks about the different ways these student groups feel marginalized on campus. The research underscores the importance of having a diversity plan and encouraging colleges to adopt diversity plans. And the research offers strategies for developing diversity plans that are aimed at reducing marginality for underserved groups of students. But there's no solid framework for actually examining these plans to see if they really do help underserved students feel less marginalized. The framework for examining ways in which diversity plans may reduce marginality for underserved groups of students is a really important tool that schools can use to find out if their plan is working, if it's really accomplishing the goals that it seeks out to set. And so to wrap up, research has indicated that colleges must do more to help retain these underserved groups of students, and comprehensive strategic diversity plans are the best way to achieve these results for students. But we must have a way to determine if they are in fact reducing marginality. The marginal man theory offers us a sound framework to evaluate these diversity plans and determine if they are reducing marginality. Thanks for watching.